This new series, I'm going to read from the Dhammapada in light of my revisiting of Buddhism in the past month or so. So, without further ado, I'm going to read directly from my copy of the Dhammapada by Gil Fronsdale, his translation. I'll read a few excerpts from the introduction, and then in my next video I'll actually read from the Dhammapada. So, introduction. The Buddha taught a path of liberation. To understand his teachings is to understand how to walk that path. Though he described it as an ancient pathway, hidden and forgotten until he rediscovered it, it remains as relevant today as it was in his time, 2,500 years ago. The Dhammapada originated in a time, culture, and spiritual tradition very different from what is familiar to most Western readers today. We might be alerted to this difference if we compare the beginning of the Dhammapada with the beginning or the opening lines of the Bible, which emphasize God's role as creator and, by extension, our reliance on God's power. In contrast, the first two verses of the Dhammapada emphasize the power of the human mind in shaping our lives and the importance of effectiveness of a person's own actions and choices. This theme reappears throughout the text. We are told, for example, that we are our own protectors and shapers of our own destinies. What we do, especially with the mind, determines our future happiness or unhappiness. Each of us must make our own effort along the Buddhist path. Teachers can only show the way. Ethical and mental purity, important ideals in the Dhammapada, cannot be achieved through intervention of others. By oneself alone is one purified. The Dhammapada, like the early Buddhist tradition, offers two distinct goals for what, in Western terms, can be called the spiritual life. The verses frequently, and even suddenly, switch to emphasize one or the other goal. The first goal focuses on attaining happiness and welfare in this life or future lives. I'm not going to preach future lives because that's one thing I don't believe. To attain the former goal, the verses emphasize virtuous actions and basic ethical teachings. So, for example, there are teachings on living by ethical precepts, watching and disciplining one's own mind, being without hate, being respectful, avoiding evil deeds, being nonviolent, avoiding evil deeds. Oh, I already said that. And curbing one's anger. Many of these are not uniquely Buddhist teachings. In fact, scholars have suggested that some verses in the Dhammapada may have been adapted from poetry, songs, and teachings already current in ancient India before and during the Buddhist time. The second, ultimate, and uniquely Buddhist goal described in the Dhammapada is liberation. This is a form of spiritual freedom that involves a radical personal change. It consists of a purification, often described forcefully, I can't read, in these verses as the elimination or destruction of one's mental defilements, attachments, and hindrances. Since these mental forces keep a person bound to the cycles of rebirth, when they are overcome, the practitioner is liberated from these cycles. For those who don't share the Buddhist belief in rebirth, it is hard to appreciate the central importance that Buddhism has traditionally placed in stepping off the wheel of life and death. Many of the important themes found in the Dhammapada are presented as dichotomies. For example, being vigilant versus being negligent, having self-control or not having it, having ill will or not, being truthful or not, developing the mind or not developing it, grief versus joy. Even the poetic structure of the Dhammapada is often built around dichotomies. Many verses are paired to present the two sides of a distinction. This is most pronounced in the first chapter, appropriately titled Dichotomies. Some pairs of chapters seem to represent dichotomies as well. For example, the chapter on the fool, followed by one on the sage. The theme of evil also appears in recurring references to Mara. A person bent on liberation needs to battle Mara. Basically, Mara is the Eastern or the Buddhist idea of Satan, basically. So, the evil one, he'll often be called the evil one. Okay, because, no, sorry about that. Verses that speak of not being seen by Mara mean, I suggest, that one overcomes death. This does not mean that liberated people don't die. Rather, it suggests first that the person is no longer susceptible to the deadening forces of Mara, such as fear, anger, and clinging, and second, that a liberated person is free from the forces leading to further rebirth and thus to further death. Some verses can come across as judgmental and lacking compassion. However, I believe that the purpose is not to denigrate any or some people as fools, but rather to describe the difference between skillful and unskillful behavior, between what leads to desirable outcomes and what does not. Fools are sometimes presented as people who are evil, but more often as people who are oblivious or distracted by worldly attachments. In closing, Gil has this to say: my hope is that my translation will enable other readers to be enriched by it as well, perhaps showing them something of the happiness toward which this religious classic is a guide. This concludes the introduction and explanation of what I'm going to cover in other videos. So stay tuned for the first chapter, Dichotomy.